study, what we are calling Sequel and Requel. We're looking at Luke's sequel to his gospel to find out what we should be like as a Requel church. We're wanting to requel the sequel, if you get the idea there. This is our third talk today, and we come to a very important part, a very important historical day in the life of the church. We come to Pentecost Sunday. Pentecost. What does Pentecost mean? Let's take a look at Acts chapter 2, verse 1. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. You remember that Jesus told them, the disciples, to all go to Jerusalem and to wait there. And so we come to this Acts 2:1, when the day of Pentecost come. I got to get out the old Greek dictionary here, Pentecost. That seems like a very big word. I gave you the Greek language, Pentekostas, and then I gave you the translation there in the American spelling, Pentecostas. And then I looked it up, and it literally means Pentecost. Isn't that very helpful? Pentecost is actually a formal name. It's a name, but built into that name is the Penta, which means 50. It means the 50th day. The 50th day. You see, there are three great feasts in the Jewish faith. There is the Passover in the spring. There is the 50th day celebration, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is often called Pentecost because it is the 50th day after Passover. And then there is the Feast of Tabernacles in the fall, at the harvest time. So we come to this day of Pentecost. This is when the Jewish people offered their very first fruits of the new grain. So this is a day of gathering. All the Jewish people were coming together. All the Hebrew people were coming together from every nation, just like they were 50 days earlier, when we come to that great Passover scene when Jesus gave his life and then rose again. But we have to view this day that we see in Acts chapter 2 in the context of Jesus' instructions from Acts 1, 4 through 8. Remember, we started here a couple of weeks ago. Jesus told them to wait in Jerusalem, and what did he say? He said you would be baptized with the Holy Spirit. Remember that? He said that you would receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. And he said the result of all that would be that you would be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. You remember all that, right? Now we have to remember that because when we take a look at what happens here, what we're about to talk about, all of that has the background of what we looked at in Acts chapter 1. You have to look at it in that view, and when we do that, we come up with this meaning of Pentecost, and I've wrote it out for you on the screen. I suggest you write this down because this will be a theme for us through the rest of our study in Acts. Pentecost, the meaning, when we talk about Pentecost, means this, that it is God's equipping his church with the power of his Spirit so that he will be glorified among the nations. I know some of you are madly writing this down, so let me say it again. Pentecost is God's equipping his church with the power of his Spirit so that he will be glorified among the nations. Now let me just break that down a little bit for you. There's 4 parts to it. We see here the beginning of the church. Jesus did not want the church to be started, to begin, without his Holy Spirit. That's why he said for them to wait, because they needed to be equipped. Now, I want you to think of something here for just a moment. Jesus had just spent 3 years with them, right? He had just given them one-on-one equipping for 3 years. I don't know about you, but if you got to spend 3 years with Jesus, don't you think you'd be pretty well equipped? But Jesus says no. 3 years with me is not enough. What you must also have is the presence of the Holy Spirit in your life. That I find to be pretty profound. So it's God's equipping his church with the power of his Spirit. You see, no matter how much we might know up here in our head, no matter how much we might read the Bible, no matter how much time we have spent with Jesus and we understand Jesus, on our own, we do not have the ability to do the things that Jesus has asked us to do. We don't have the ability to live the life that Jesus has in mind for us. We don't have the power to be able to build his church the way that he has in mind for it to be built. In order for us to do the things that Jesus has equipped us for, we must also have the power of his Spirit. And we must never forget that this is all ultimately so that he will be glorified. Now, all of us, I think, want to, hopefully, within our deepest selves, want to glorify God and not ourselves. But here is an interesting aspect of this. Without God's Spirit helping us, we don't have the ability to glorify God. We are inherently selfish. We inherently, automatically, without thinking about it, our default status is to glorify ourselves. And it's only when we have the Spirit's power in our life equipping us that we have the ability to glorify God. And that we don't just glorify God here when we come to worship, although wasn't it wonderful this morning? Thank you, Brandy and Trish, for leading us in that wonderful experience. But the whole point that we see in Acts that Jesus gave them and that we see in this definition of Pentecost is God's equipping his church with the power of his Spirit so that he will be glorified where? Among the nations. Not just inside of these four walls, but that we go out in our daily lives and that we see and we run into people and that they can see God's at work in us. And God's purpose for his church is to expand beyond those initial walls that we see in Jerusalem. And certainly that is true still for us today here at Church Requel. So, remember that definition. We're going to come back to it over and over again over the course of this summer. So we come back to Acts 2:1. They're all together. And then we see three dramatic things happen. This is the verses 2 through 4, which we're going to keep our focus on this morning. There are three things that happen, what I'm going to call three symbols that take place in the history of the church, all at one time. Symbol number one, the sound of a violent rushing wind. Verse 2, suddenly a sound like a blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. Now, it's important for us to understand this is not just a sound that they heard inside the room, but this was a sound that they heard all around. We're going to get to this verse next week, but just skip ahead a little bit to verse 6, the beginning of verse 6. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment. We're going to talk about that next week, but it's important for you to gather in this mind that this is not just an upper room sound. This is a sound that fills this upper room, but fills the outside area too, so that people come out of their houses to see what's going on. Now, this has two impacts, one immediate and one forever. The first, an immediate impact, was, as we just mentioned, the attention that it grabbed. Something big is happening, and it's happening right now, and we can't miss it. Not just for the disciples, but for all the people who are there in Jerusalem, and it gathers this crowd. So that's the immediate impact. But there is a second impact, one that we still recognize and that I want to dwell on today, and that is this, that the sound of the wind was a picture of God's invisible power. The sound of the wind was a picture of God's invisible power. We hear wind. Some of us heard it quite a bit this week, right, with the thunderstorms that came through. We can hear wind, and we can feel the wind's power, right? But we cannot, what? See the wind. We can see the results of the wind, but the wind itself is invisible to us, right? Jesus himself said in John 3:8 that the wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. Even in those early days, Jesus was talking about the coming of the Holy Spirit. This is what spirit life is like. Now, I don't know if you thought about this or not. Interestingly, the disciples heard the noise of the wind, but there is no indication anywhere in this scripture that they felt the blowing. They heard it, but they couldn't. It wasn't like things were blowing all over the place, like they had to close the shutters. How weird would that be? That you hear wind, but you're not feeling wind, and you're not seeing the impact. In other words, this is a holy wind, and there is an impact, but it's not the impact of a wind. Fascinating truth. The word for spirit and the word for wind are the same in both original languages. The original language of Greek and the original language of Hebrew. In the Old Testament and the New Testament alike, if you said wind, it's the same word as spirit. If you said spirit, it's the same word as wind. I think God kind of has a sense of humor here. The Holy Spirit / wind is coming upon you, and you will hear it. But it's not real wind. It's not wind like wind blowing in. It's wind like the Spirit is blowing in. Do you see the significance of that? The Holy Spirit like a wind, like a mighty power, but we cannot see him. We can only see his effects. So that's the first symbol, the sound of a violent rushing wind. But it's not just that. We have another symbol, the second symbol that we see here in verse 3, tongues of fire resting upon each person there. Tongues of fire resting on each person. Let me read verse 3 for you. They saw what seemed to be, it's very important language, what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. Now, it's important language, what seemed to be. They really don't know what in fact it was. We don't really know today what in fact it was. They could only describe what it looked like to them. And what it looked like was like there was this little flame going on. Like when you have a fire and you have a fireplace and you see the flames crackling up above the wood. Just imagine that picture without the wood. Where the fireplace is, where the wood is, put your face. And above your face is the fire. That's what it seemed like to them. They don't know what it was. They can't describe it any better than that, but that's what it appeared to be. So, just like the first symbol where we have the wind without the effect of the blowing, here we have the fire. It appears to be a fire, but it's not really fire. We don't know what it is. So what is this? The appearance of fire, it symbolizes God's holy presence. Now, you don't have to be a preacher or a theologian to be able to understand this. If you have read throughout the Bible up to this point, you would get this. Fire has often symbolized God's presence. We go back to Exodus chapter 3, verse 2, and we see that Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. Right? Remember the burning bush? Later, Israel was guided and protected by a pillar of fire. Do you remember that? They would move for 40 years. They would go and at night there would be a pillar of fire. And if the pillar of fire moved, that would be God's presence moving, and wherever God went, they followed. And that's how they followed. John the Baptist predicts that Jesus is going to baptize, what does he say? With Holy Spirit and fire. Jesus himself Go back to one of the verses that we studied last year, Luke chapter 12, verse 49. Jesus says, I have come to bring fire on the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. What's the fire? Now we understand what he's talking about. He says, I have come that we might have the Holy Spirit here, and I wish it were already started. He's saying, I wish we could get to this date where we're at here today on the day of Pentecost. Hebrews 12:29 describes God as a consuming fire. And just so we get the point, the fire trucks go by. Fire. It brings both heat and light. You know, you just can't plan for that kind of stuff. Thank you, Lord. I love his exclamation points. Fire brings heat and light. Heat of a fire consumes the dross, purifying, leaving only the gold behind, right? Or if there is no gold, just burning up everything. Oftentimes, fire has been described as the zeal that a Christian has. And Jesus says oftentimes, or we see throughout the scripture, I wish that you were not lukewarm. I wish rather that you were on what? Fire, right? Also, we see fire mentioned as an illumination that God brings to spiritual darkness. So over and over and over and over again, we have seen the identification of fire with God and God's presence. And so we have this second symbol, the appearance of fire. Now, before we move on to the third, it's important that we have something in mind here. Because these very first two, the sound of the wind and the appearance of fire, those first two symbols, they should govern how we understand what we're about to talk about. We cannot look at this third without understanding the first two. Does that make sense? I'm calling these three symbols. They really did happen, but it's not the example of what happens to every single Christian who receives the Spirit today. You may receive the Spirit and not have the rushing wind. You may receive the Spirit and not have the fire above your head. And the third is no different. The third symbol is speaking in other languages. Verse 4. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages or tongues. The NIV gives you the ability to look at it either way. It's the same word, tongues or languages as the Spirit enabled them. The NIV gives us a footnote which explains that this word for tongues can also be translated languages. And indeed, as we read here, there are Jewish people there for Passover and then again for Pentecost who spoke many different languages. And suddenly, unexpectedly, inexplicably, the disciples could speak in their language and be understood. Again, more on this next week, so come back. But the important thing for us to note now is that this speaking in other languages that we see here, this is not an ecstatic utterance of a God language. It literally was the miraculous ability to speak a foreign language that they had not studied, that native speakers who were there understood. Again, we'll look at the details of how we know that's true next week. But we combine here this appearance of tongues with now the fact that the disciples begin to speak in other languages, miraculously enabled by the Holy Spirit. You see, God's holy power comes upon people through God's holy word. And so this other languages symbolizes the proclamation of God's holy word. Just like the first two were symbols, this is a symbol also, a symbol of God's holy word. The disciples, these apostles, were charged by Jesus in the chapter before. That's why we have to look at everything that happens here in light of Jesus' instructions. These disciples, apostles, were charged by Jesus with the spreading of God's word. But how are they going to do that if they cannot speak the language? And so God, through his Holy Spirit, provides them a miracle to give them the ability to be understood. But not just for any message, not just for anything they want to say, specifically for God's message, what we call the gospel. Paul puts it this way in Romans chapter 1, verse 16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is what? The power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. And again, just right, almost as if it's out of Jesus' mouth. First to the Jews and then to the Gentiles. In other words, it starts in Jerusalem, goes to Judea, and spreads to the uttermost parts of the world. Do you see here how closely the Apostle Paul's verse in Romans 1:16 matches Jesus' instructions in Acts chapter 1? The gospel message begins with the Jews, but it doesn't remain there. It moves beyond the boundaries of Jerusalem, beyond the restrictions of the Hebrew faith. And if God gives me breath long enough, man, this is where I would love to go with you. When we talk about the Requel church, I want to be able to take a look at Acts, and then I want to take a look at Romans, and then I want to take a look at James. That's going to take us a few years, all right? But this is what we want to be able to understand who we are as a church today. This is the story of much of the rest of Acts in the New Testament. Now let's come back to this today. In these few minutes that we have left, let's combine these three symbols with Jesus' instructions. What do we have? First of all, we have the sound of the violent wind, God's invisible power. We cannot see the Holy Spirit, but we can know that he's with us because we see his effects in our lives. We are not expected to accomplish God's mission through our own power. Rather, we are expected to achieve Jesus' instructions, God's mission, through our weakness, through the Holy Spirit's power. And then we come up with this second symbol, these tongues of fire, which represents God's presence in our life. Just like the Israelites never proceeded ahead of or behind of, but stayed right with the pillar of fire, we are never expected to go and witness for God without God being present with us. He never leaves us. He never forsakes us, no matter what trials we are going through. And so many of you throughout this last year or two could testify to this much more so than I could. We know God's presence is with us. And then we have this third symbol that we see here, the speaking in tongues. We're looking here at God's holy word. We are not expected to be able to argue or become an expert in our own rightness or anyone else's wrongness. What we should be is fluent in God's word, because his word is the language that translates into all languages. And we see God's prediction on that being fulfilled even as we speak, and being accepted and understood by all people. So it's important to note here, we may not experience the sound of the violent wind or see the appearance of tongues or fire above our heads, and we may not suddenly speak in a static foreign language. But when the Holy Spirit is alive in us, and God promises that to every single Christ follower, then we will know his power. We will experience his presence, and we will speak his word. Pentecost still means God's equipping his church with the power of his Spirit so that he will be glorified among all the nations. Now, here's my question for you, and it's the question that we're going to be focused on all summer long. Are you on mission? Are you on mission? Are you on mission with God's Spirit, his presence, his power, his word?